Hey there, teacher friends. This is Bill MacDonald, the ELAR Right Prescription Doctor, and I want to share a video with you on how to correctly use colons. Now, I know that sometimes people think it's inappropriate, comma, but another word for part of my anatomy, my butt, is a colon. So, since the word colon and the word semicolon are similar in terms of they're in the middle of a sentence, your colon is in the middle of your body. And so sometimes you have to teach things that are really difficult in a simple way that your kids can understand. The question that we're going to look at today only had 47% correct in Texas. It was the lowest scoring editing question for 10th graders this spring. And so we need to make sure we understand that a colon is practiced by as many secondary grades as possible so that if they test it in ninth or 10th grade, our students will be ready to handle it without a problem. A colon basically is an independent clause with a subject and a predicate, followed by a colon, which means here comes a list or some examples over here of what that independent clause was writing or talking about. So let's take a look at the question. That's the best way to kind of help you see. And so I would suggest that you do a lot of examples, extend lessons that involve colons, think about statements that you can make. And so we'll try a couple in this video where we can have an independent clause followed by a colon, which is a list or some examples of what we talked about in the independent clause. So without further ado, let me share the screen with you. This was question number 17 on the 2021 test for Texas that was taken in April, and the state average was 47. That means more than half of the kids did not know how to correctly apply a punctuation mistake that needed a colon because it had a comma, but it needs to be converted to a colon. So we'll find out why. And just as a reminder, there's something, an independent clause, followed by a colon with a list, sort of like a dependent clause, but it's not really because you need a subject and a predicate to have a dependent to be a dependent clause. So it's a list or examples about the independent clause. So remembering the strategies, use something. I don't like cube because cube starts with circle. I think it's very important that we read, and for class and group assignments, we can read loudly, but when we're testing with a partner or we're testing by ourselves, we should read this softly. So we would say, what change, if any, should be made in sentence 21? We would underline and label. The word change can be underlined. And remember, like 99% of the time, as soon as you see the word change in an editing question, you're going to label where the change needs to be made with brackets or highlighting it. And then you can write the word cups. That means the mistake can only be a capitalization, usage, punctuation, or spelling mistake. So sentence 21, delete the comma after ounces. So ounces, comma, that would be punctuation. Change uses, present tense, pointing right down, to used, past tense, moving backwards. So we'd have to check, because those are both words that are correctly spelled, we have to check the subject verb agreement to see if it's past tense or present tense. Letter C says change the comma after units to a colon. That's going to be the correct answer. So we're going to have to learn how to do that if half the kids in Texas didn't know how to. And of course, because there's a problem with leaving the comma there, we can't pick no change. So we're going to take a look again. We don't need to look at the entire passage. All they're asking us to do is look at sentence 21, stop at the beginning of sentence 21, and stop at the end of sentence 21. Just read that. So because I'm so old and blind, I'll put on my reading glasses for this part. We labeled that it's question 17. That way we don't get question 17 confused with sentence 17. So question 17 is about sentence 21, which is what they said. So because it's punctuation related, I'm going to make sure I verbalize all of these punctuation marks. Capital. Those hesitant about the switch might complain that instead of familiar miles, comma, short bounce, feet, comma, and ounces, comma, the metric system uses different units. My brain made me pause. So we either need a period there, a colon, or a semicolon. Every time you're pausing like that, your thought is complete. The reason that all these commas are there are commas in a series: miles, feet, ounces, things that we measure in a lot of the United States, but they mention here that we are now using the metric system more. A comma, a meter measures length. So our subject has, it's a compound subject, meters measuring length, comma, a gram measures mass, comma, and a liter measures volume. So it's sort of like three subjects and predicates, what each one does, commas in a series. So it's pretty unique because this one has the subject and what it measures, the predicate for each one, as you can see here. I don't really like the repetition, but that's sort of like the only way that you can say it, and then you say period. Okay, so letter A said delete the comma after ounces. Let's check and see why we would do that or why we're not. Those hesitant about the switch might complain that instead we're getting ready to be dependent on something here. Instead of familiar miles, feet, and ounces, comma. So that little part, that dependent, that phrase that we have here, the familiar miles, feet, and ounces, that's a little clue that you're getting ready to give an alternative. So whenever you're going from the instead, opposite, or other, you usually follow it with a comma, which is that one right there. Then we have the independent clause. The metric system uses different units, comma, a meter measures length. So we wouldn't want to remove this comma because it separates this little phrase about one thing by a comma to start talking about another thing. Letter B says change uses present tense right now to used past tense, drawing an arrow backwards. So let's check and see how it sounds when we try that. Those hesitant about the switch might complain, that's present tense, then instead of the familiar feet, miles, the metric system used. So since that is talking about right now or in the future, they wouldn't want to be using past tense right there, used. You wouldn't want to switch from present or something that could happen in the future to something that happened in the past. So that wouldn't make sense. So we'd eliminate that one. Change the comma after units to a colon. And that's yes, as long as we have an independent clause followed by the colon with either a list of something or examples of something. So let's see why it's correct. Those hesitant about the switch might complain that instead of familiar feet, miles, comma, feet, comma, and ounces, comma, the metric system uses different units, colon. That's the metric system uses different units. So basically we're talking about units. What units does the metric system use? What examples do they give us? A meter measures length, comma, a gram measures mass, comma, and a liter measures volume, period. So perhaps because these were all commas in a series with subjects and predicates, maybe your kids had a little bit of trouble understanding that it was still a list or it was examples. And so I highly suggest that you practice some independent clauses followed by a colon with lists of things that have both a subject and a predicate. But I would suggest you start with something simple like, I love to go to the movies every weekend to eat snacks, colon. And so then I need an example or a list of the snacks that I might like to eat. My friend makes a lot of mistakes when he's driving down the highway, colon. He runs red lights, comma. He does rolling stops, comma. And he turns without using his blinker, period. So that second time, I had a list of examples of three things that my friend does, but making sure that I mentioned the subject uh, three times, he, uh, in the way that they mentioned three different subjects, and the word measure is there three times, but I used the same subject three times. So hopefully that gets you the idea. And so that's why we can't pick letter D, no mistake. So I would highly suggest that you go ahead and have some paper, blank sheets of paper, and what you're going to do is get some yellow crayons, colored pencils or markers, and have your students draw a comma and make a little table and have your kids do a comma and make it yellow where you're slowing the sentence down for different comma rules, because a comma, if I use it as a ball, it would be a shorter bounce on the table for a shorter pause. A period, an exclamation, and a question mark would be a longer bounce because the entire sentence is stopping, a complete stop. So the reason I want to put the comma on the table is so that we can separate it from an apostrophe, because an apostrophe and a contraction, they're both up there in the air. They look the same, but an up apostrophe is up and a comma comes on down. So up apostrophe, comma, come on down. So help your kids draw each of those. Then you would have them in the secondary practice semicolons where you have independent clause. You can write out IC, capital I, little c, semicolon, independent clause, little I, little c, period, or exclamation or question mark, or independent capital I, whatever the first word is, independent clause, subject and a predicate, colon, a list or some examples, and then a period when you're done giving your list. And making those yellow will help your students remember that those punctuation marks are slowing the sentence down. The only one that I didn't mention here because it hasn't shown up in any of the questions is quotation marks, and they're also up in the air. So yellow is when you slow down and they're up there in the air. So I could say opening quotations, whatever somebody says, and closing quotations. So if you think of it like this, I have a mouth when I speak. My dimples are before my mouth and after my mouth, before I speak and after I finish speaking. So I can have my opening and my closing dimples between the actual words that come out of the speaker's mouth, if that makes sense. And so whenever there's dialogue, make sure we have two sets of quotation marks, or in Spanish, they call them guiones, where they have the little lines before the person in the story starts talking, and after he finishes, they call them the little lines, guiones, or you could also use quotation marks in Spanish. I heard from a grader that they assume that if the student is in a Spanish classroom from third, fourth, or fifth grade and using quotation marks in Spanish, that they're probably in a dual language classroom and they don't want to penalize them. And so on the really short answers and the extended answers, they were stressing the fact that just answer the question and make sure you show us where the answer is at. And we're not going to hold you too accountable on for conventions unless we can't even read what you're writing. Just as in the old days, if the paper is indecipherable or illegible, your kids can get a 0. So I hope that this video has helped you. Do me a favor and click like on the YouTube video. Subscribe if you're not already following me on YouTube. And if you're watching it like most of you are on Facebook, go ahead and do me a favor and um, share it with some of your writing teacher friends who are secondary teachers. Uh, Sixth through eighth grade don't necessarily need to be good at colons and semicolons, but they have been tested on in seventh grade on them before. So I suggest that you make sure your kids get good at understanding the difference between when to use a semicolon and when to use a colon. Thank you guys.